Thanks everyone for joining us today. So I'm going to talk about the history of redlining in Indianapolis. My goal of this brief presentation is to bring up some questions and highlight resources that help us think about how policies erase and reshape sections of the city, how concepts like platting and zoning and land use intersect with housing, transit, and commerce, how these decisions made 50, 100, even 200 years ago greatly impact how we navigate the city today, where we live, where some of us can live, where some of us feel like we can live, how we get to work, what and how many amenities we have access to, how we understand how our movement through the city is entirely determined on a lot of these historic decisions. So let's get started. I'm a trained public historian, but I'm interested in historic preservation, urban planning, marginalized voices, underrepresented communities, and digital humanities. Reading through all of that, I just say that I'm queer, I'm angry, and I'm an accomplice to fighting white supremacy capitalism. And my main goal is, I know I'm a good architectural historian. I know I'm good at finding things. So how can I take my skills and help advocates today sort of fight in that realm of spatial equity? If I have the skill, I can certainly help people understand the historic context of why we're in this fight today. So how did I get here? I started at the Historical Society archive 6 years ago, working on the bicentennial and architectural collections. And as I was working on the bicentennial, I had a great opportunity to sort of rediscover long lost collections, bring in new content, sort of layer different items and artifacts and tell new stories and think about how to curate and exhibit and consider new programming. And what really interested me was thinking about critical narratives, right? So I think when a lot of people think about a bicentennial, they think about a celebration. And what I felt was that there is a violence and an erasure when we become city boosterists, and we need to be careful. There's always a time to celebrate, but there's also a time to ask uncomfortable questions and think about how not everything is great. Not everything is great for everyone. So, playing on that fine line of, yes, this is a celebration, but it's also a moment where we can think critically together. So that brings us to the topic at hand. What is redlining? So let's talk about redlining. My definition is this is the discriminatory practice by which banks, mortgage lenders, and insurance companies refused or limited loans, mortgages, and insurance within specific geographic areas, particularly in older and inner city neighborhoods, to non-white and or low-income families by the guidance of the Federal Housing Administration's Homeowners Loan Corporation. In addition to that, realtors and real estate developers misrepresented markets and discriminated against prospective homebuyers in order to control the market values. So redlining has created this cultural and financial dynamic that it favors white homebuyers, and it creates an adverse effect for racially oppressed people, particularly Black communities. And if you look at this map, this redlining map of Indianapolis, you can see with the key that green is considered best areas, blue is considered still desirable, yellow would be definitely declining, and red would be hazardous. So how did they come up with this sort of system, right? If you want to look through all the primary sources for this, I highly recommend this website, Mapping Inequality. They've gone through the trouble of digitizing all of these historic records and making them interactive on a map. So you can actually click on different sections of the city and read these area description forms. So let's talk a little bit about these forms that they use to sort of make a judgment call, make an evaluation on different neighborhoods. So people from the HLC were coming out and surveying these neighborhoods and ranking areas based on a few different factors. First, there was population, right? So they're looking at things like Black population, immigrant or foreign born, low income, laborers. They're also evaluating housing stock and sort of the materiality of the houses. There's also a little bit of assessment values you can see sort of near the bottom of the page here. And then you'll see a little bit of environmental or zoning factors. So I have outlined just some different things that spoke to me in different sections of these forms, but you'll see, even though this area is considered hazardous, they write better class Negro. Here are more examples from Indianapolis. We've got almost solid Negro. Another detrimental influence, age and inhabitants. And then this last one kind of gets at that sort of zoning or proximity to industry, part is factory district. So there's lots of reasons why areas get devalued, they get redlined. But a lot of times it comes down to the inhabitants and race. So why does this matter? Why does this historic decision, why is it even relevant today? Well, it's never really stopped. We're still thinking about the implications and the contemporary ways that this decision, this federal policy, is embedded into our housing and financial systems today. I mean, these are just a few of many, many headlines that you can find when you start looking into all of the home ownership and banking and real estate issues we're dealing with today based on race. So let's break it down a little bit more. How do we see sort of the landscape change over time based on these policies, right? So this is a little bit before redlining. This is to sort of set the stage. This is the Northwest Side in 1916. This is about, that diagonal street is about 400 to the 900 blocks of Indiana Avenue. This is a base map. So if you really like maps, I encourage you to check out Map Indy, and you can play with all sorts of maps and aerial photographs. So here you can see, this is a pretty developed, built up part of downtown. It's really dense. The yellow structures are going to be your wood sided, framed. Usually it's a lot of houses. And then you can notice sort of along the avenue, there's more pink blocks. Those are going to be brick structures. These are going to tend to be your commercial structures. And it's pretty well built up, right? So what happens over time? Here's an aerial from 1941. It's still pretty much the same. This is just going to be 4 years after the redlining policy sort of happens. And then by 1979, you really see significant violence to the landscape, right? And here is just a comparison looking at 41 to 1986. There's significant destruction from multiple policies. So spoiler alert, I might have tricked you with a redlining talk, but I actually want to talk about a few other policies that fall into this continuum of displacement, right? So redlining is just one piece of the puzzle. What does white supremacy capitalism do once overt systems of oppression are eliminated? It creates new covert systems, right? So we stole land, we stole people. Now we're going to start doing different policies that are race-based and economic-based to harm people, right? So this is sort of my timeline, and you can see redlining here in the middle, but I want to go back and think about other forms of displacement. So my definition of displacement, and this is a working definition, but displacement occurs when residents can no longer they can't afford to remain in their homes due to rising rents or property taxes or home values. Residents may be forced out due to eminent domain, dropped leases, evictions, or conditions that render the home unlivable. they are discriminated against, or there are changes in land use or zoning. So what else is going on? A few decades before redlining, we have racial covenants. So a covenant is a legal document on the transfer of property. Typically, a homeowner is restricting the next homeowner based on race, ethnicity, or religion. So thanks, Brad. I think you're on this call. You gave me a copy of an Indianapolis racial covenant. It's actually kind of difficult to find these for Indianapolis. That's a whole nother talk, but I'd love to do more work on this. So this is an example of a racial covenant for the area at 45th and Central Avenue. So this section I've marked right here, kind of near the bottom, it's hard to read, but it says racial restrictions. The ownership or occupancy of lots and buildings in this edition are forever restricted to the members of the pure white race. No Negro, Japanese, Chinese, or person of any other race or mixture of race, except the members of the pure white race, shall acquire title to any lot or building. So this standard was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1948, after decades in practice. But just because it's over doesn't mean there's not still an impact. There's this lingering limitation of opportunities, and it's forever changing a neighborhood. So let's go forward in time now, a little bit after redlining. The next policy that happens is urban renewal. So this is a federal policy that occurs, in the 1930s and the 1950s. And the idea was that, aged parts of the cities are overcrowded, the housing stock has aged, things are in poor condition, it's beyond repair. A lot of times you hear this referred to as slum clearance. Today, they've rebranded it as blight elimination. So federal governments, and then sometimes you would see municipal authorities, usually like a local public housing department, they would select areas for slum clearance. This is also compounded by a few other factors going on. There's the GI Bill, there's that early form of like suburbanization. But either way, this does create a significant amount of displacement of communities of people, and it creates vast areas of demolition. So here I have overlaid the 6 areas selected for urban renewal on top of the redlining map. What do you notice? Almost all of these areas are in formerly redlined areas. One is in yellow, which is, the second worst. So I know that, we can't say everything is connected just because it happens this way, that causation correlation argument. But what I hope to show you in the next few maps is that when you start seeing the same pattern over and over again, it's related, and it's related to this devaluation of land. So here's just one example of slum clearance of urban renewal. This is actually along Mass Ave, and this is to show you that on the same block we have these nice looking, lovely looking apartment buildings that are considered uninhabitable. And what we get below is a mass demolition of multiple blocks. And this is part of my upcoming research, is sort of teasing out sort of the building status and the actual deterioration or maintenance of buildings in redlined areas, because I actually think this part of the argument is bogus, but this ultimately becomes part of Renaissance Place. So what happens next? The next decade comes urban highways. So displacement and redevelopment are continuing with the Federal Highway Act of 1956. We have this interloop highway system, that's 6570, that is really detrimental because you already have these established neighborhoods. You have this really dense urban core. And the highways are particularly damning because, they're bisecting neighborhoods. They're cutting neighborhoods off of downtown. There's no sense of quality of life issues, of connectivity for these once thriving areas. By some accounts, maybe over 20,000 buildings were demolished and possibly over 22,000 residents were displaced. I think it's a little bit unproven and maybe a little bit conservative, but we need to really think about the physical and psychological barriers of this violent act. It harmed a lot of people. And you can see what I've marked on here is to show you the main stretch of Indiana Avenue, just to kind of give you a sense of place that even though it's not directly on the route, there still is significant change. And I'd actually argue that West Street is essentially an exit ramp at this point. So just to give you some more details, this is the north split. So that area where 65 and 70 come together on the northeast side. Just so you can really see the scale of all of the homes and businesses that are displaced and these people that once occupied these spaces. And here is the south split. So this is where 65 and 70 kind of break apart in the Fountain Square area. Again, this is a mass demolition of a lot of houses and buildings. So take the highway map and put it over the redlining map. And what do you see? Again, most of the inner loop is pretty much entirely in formerly redlined areas. There's a little bit in yellow and a very tiny sliver in blue, which is still considered good if you look on the south side and the sort of right in front of Garfield Park. But for the most of this, it's in red and yellow sort of devalued areas. And we can't ignore these decisions. So this is a little bit of a manic rambling from my brain, but I call this sort of how policies and systems have a consequence for people who are oppressed and these barriers I have to deal with today, right? So there's all these different things going on related to place, and a lot of it has to do with housing. And there are a lot of barriers that have to be dealt with. And what we end up doing is we have a lot of advocacy groups who are trying to find, Band-Aid solutions for these consequences, because our federal and state governments don't always pass laws that are in our interest. So this is a little of an editorial slide, very removed from sort of architectural history, but it's just to show you sort of where I'm connecting the dots with policy and advocacy today. So why does all this stuff matter? So I spend a lot of time just looking at old photos of buildings, identifying unidentified street scenes. And so this is sort of my gateway drug into thinking about displacement and redevelopment. I was looking at old photos in different archival collections, right? So one of my favorite collections to explore, if you haven't, the link is on this slide, and the next slide is IUPUI's Indiana Landmarks Central Canal and IUPUI Image Collection. So this was done in 1974, and some surveyors from Indiana Landmarks went out and just methodically photo documented all of the structures like on Indiana Avenue that were on the streets in what is now IUPUI, like that was all housing before. And this collection is incredible, and it shows you sort of the symbolism of lost opportunity that was Indiana Avenue. And that these places, like look at these buildings, they're really not that far gone. Mass Ave looked the same, Virginia Ave looked the same. So what's different? Like how much of this is implicit bias and racism? The city and preservationist and philanthropic leaders save buildings in awful conditions in other parts of town. So why not the avenue? Why not Indiana Avenue? And this slide on the right just kills me. This one absolutely kills me, because you've seen buildings that look like this that have been preserved in other parts of the town. So bringing us to more contemporary times, let's talk about gentrification. So my definition of gentrification is the restoration or redevelopment of homes, businesses, and other amenities in quote unquote rundown or less desired urban areas, accompanied with an influx of middle class or affluent people, resulting in the actual or perceived displacement of low income residents and changing the cultural character of a neighborhood. So all these different policies that I've shown you, these historic decisions create layers of disinvestment, right? Some people leave because they can afford to, others stay. But eventually this disinvestment creates such low land values that it becomes a tempting investment for others, right? So that's where gentrification comes in as this inevitable next phase that kind of started with racial covenants and redlining. And now we're sort of living through the impact of this today. So I really like this Savvy data. It's showing neighborhoods that have gentrified based on a lot of metrics. I think that this is a pretty solid report, and it's showing you what you see in blue are neighborhoods that have been considered gentrified based on their metrics, starting in 1980 and comparing with 1990, 2000, 2010, and 2016. And what do you see? It's growing, right? And it's mostly in Center Township. And a lot of this is in formerly redline neighborhoods. And it doesn't stop there. I always want to talk about evictions because I think we don't talk about renters or give them the same kind of platform that sometimes we talk about homeowners. But I really encourage you to look at Eviction Lab. It's a data portal that shows eviction rates across the country, and Indianapolis has a really horrific eviction rate. We are 5% higher than the national average. And evictions are just getting worse in this pandemic. So here I've overlaid the eviction data on top of the redlining map. So it's a little bit less obvious, but you do see this really strong sort of band where evictions are higher with these bigger bubbles in this strip from west to east, but it's just north of downtown. And we do have a similar strip of redlined and yellow devalued neighborhoods sort of in that northern band just north of downtown. What else has happened lately? We see this 80+ year legacy of planning and redevelopment projects leading to the mass disinvestment and crippled infrastructure and quality of life issues. And so now we have this recent strategy known as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which is playing with the idea of opportunity zones, which is really just, I would be suspect of any policy kind of put together by former real estate grifters, but you do you. But I think it's really interesting that you're letting investors who probably don't live in these areas make capital investments that they benefit from, and there's really no community engagement or oversight for the people who live and experience these places. So when you put the opportunity zone map on top of the redlining map, you see a very similar pattern, right? You see a lot of these areas that they've labeled opportunity zones are formerly devalued redline neighborhoods, and the yellow definitely declining areas. There's a little bit of blue on the south side, but and then there's one strip sort of north of Crown Hill that was formerly blue and green. But for the most part, this is all formerly redline areas. And then if you look at LISC's Great Places 2020 initiative, which was really the first aha moment I had, where they're trying to, put investments back into neighborhoods that have been sort of ignored for many decades. 4 out of 5 of the Great Places 2020 neighborhoods they selected are formerly redlined, which really shows you that we're still living with this legacy of inequitable planning and policy decisions. So this is, I know for some of you designers, this is probably like a horrifying logo that I put together. So please forgive my crude PowerPoint skills, but everything is connected, right? And when we silo knowledge and when we silo history, it's really hard to sort of pull these different facets and understand how it's all connected. But what gives me life is sort of like finding these receipts and helping advocates understand the historic context of these intersections and how place-based history really matters. And we can find a lot of insight through sort of scholarship and the archives. So there's still a lot of work to do. There's so much scholarship and research to be done. How do we mitigate and subvert and challenge what has transpired over the last 200 years? You know, be an active accomplice, fight against racism and all forms of white supremacy capitalism. But what does that look like day to day? You know, that's, you know, advocating for supportive policies on a lot of these topics. It's supporting activists, support advocacy organizations and other service-oriented groups, get active with local government. So much of this, if we just supported local government, they could come up with some creative tools to sort of combat, you know, preemptive state laws. Stay educated on new reports and data, work to understand the historic context. Nowhere to go if you or a friend is a victim of contemporary forms of housing discrimination. You know where to go to seek help, or know who to ask to sort of find these services. You know, if you're upset about affordable housing options in town, look at community land trusts. We have a group here. If you're upset about what's going on with the highway, check out Rethink 6570. The city will be shaped by historic moments around us today, thinking about 2020's pandemic, police brutality, racial inequality, our national housing and eviction crisis. They all stem from historic policy. Our city is a stage of accumulated and intentional inequitable design choices, and the future is uncertain, but onward we must go, speaking our truth, finding connections and coalitions in solidarity. Here are a few resources if you want to read further. I can drop these on Twitter after our chat. Some recommended readings. If you're a bookworm, here are some of my favorite books that get at this topic in numerous ways. Coming up, if you want to hear from me again in the future, in a couple weeks, I'll be doing an extended session on this content for the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana. It's an amazing interdisciplinary housing conference in town. I'd highly recommend checking that out. The next day, I'll be at IU's Style of the State Symposium, talking about hostile architecture and sort of that survey work. Definitely check out Indie Design Week later in April. I believe I'm doing a session on LGBTQ historic sites and our city historic preservation initiative. And then if you are part of MIBOR, I'll be doing a similar redlining talk coming up. And then part of this research is funded by the Indiana Humanities. I'm part of the Anti-Black Racial Injustice Research Fellowship cohort this year. There's 4 of us. And so my project is looking at redlining and sort of picking apart the original documentation, doing some more visual architectural analysis. So I'll be presenting additional research later this summer and this fall as I'm wrapping up that fellowship. And then if you are interested in hearing more of my rambling, you are welcome to contact me. I've started my own independent research consulting firm called the History Concierge, and you can find me on the web, or you can just tweet at me too. Thank you.